body whose leaders feel somewhat beholden to the to these nations, and therefore it's very hypocritical to say that WHO is at fault for listening too much to China. If tomorrow the boot was on the US foot, they'd listen too much to the US too. I think one of the things we have to do as a result of all of this is to strengthen the autonomy of these UN bodies. Make, for example, the Director Generalship or the Secretary Generalship a one-term post with a longer term, let's say 6 years or 7 years, so that you don't end up in a situation where the Secretary General feels beholden to the big powers who can block his re-election, and they can just go ahead and do their work with autonomy and independence. That would be the best way to avoid having to criticize WHO in the future.
That was an eye-opener right there. But do you think there are a lot of theories about the origin of COVID-19, and do you think we should hold China responsible for this? I mean, they were able to contain it in Wuhan and not even get to Beijing, which is hardly 300 kilometers from Wuhan. But it got through to all over the world. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that the thing about the virus is we don't really know enough about it. There is still the theory that may have escaped from a lab. I think the theory that it was an engineered virus, a man-made virus, has been poo-pooed now by the majority of scientific opinion and by the international community, as well as by the U.S. intelligence services who've been quoted in the American media. So let's assume it was a natural virus, a biological virus, probably a zoonotic virus, something that transmits from animals to human beings. So you can say it's the Chinese habit of having wet markets where wild animals are bought and sold and slaughtered for human consumption that has made it possible for such viruses to escape their natural habitat in wild animals and reach human beings. Bats, pangolins, all sorts of animals are probably responsible. And the thing about that is you can blame Chinese cultural habits and their eating habits, but it's difficult to blame China as having deliberately engineered this, because they also suffered, at least initially, and then others in the end also suffered. So I would say very simply that the way we're looking at it today, our line should quite simply be that, whoever did it, we need a transparent inquiry as to what happened, how did it escape, what was the origin, just so we can learn lessons for all of humanity, not in a spirit of blaming anyone or pointing fingers at China, but just to ensure that next time we're all better prepared and can forestall this kind of thing. Maybe wet markets need to be banned by the Chinese, but we'll have to see on the basis of a proper study.
A lot of companies today want to move out of China. Quite a few of them are moving to Cambodia and Vietnam. And do you see this as an opportunity for India? And post this COVID-19, do you see a hope for India being out of the third world tag?
Well, look, I think it can be an opportunity for India, but we have to get our act together. And so far, I'm not sure we have. Our biggest problem in terms of attracting foreign businesses is our regulatory environment. And actually, if anything, the entire lockdown process has revealed our bureaucracy at its worst, with a series of confusing and contradictory regulations coming out day after day. They issue one regulation today, a clarification tomorrow, a contradiction the third. It's becoming incredibly difficult for people to interpret what the government wants and is doing. Everything is top-down. It's heavily regulated.
So that leads me to my next question. Do you really think...
Let me answer one more thing, Lakshman. I'll come to that. So therefore, the worry is how do we manage to convince foreign companies that actually it will be easy for them to do business in India instead of having a bureaucracy running rampant. Secondly, we have our taxmen. The government gives completely unrealistic revenue targets to the tax authorities, the IRS people, the revenue intelligence, and they go out and they terrorize business people in order to extract whatever money they can out of them in order to meet the tax targets issued by the government. That too has to stop. Thirdly, we have real issues of land being expensive and difficult to procure. The government is addressing that by creating a land bank, so that's the right thing they're doing, so that companies know they have a place to go to which is prepared to receive them. And finally, there are labor issues. I'm not sure that the way in which the UP government has just simply abolished labor laws is the right way to go. We need labor regulatory reform, and that should be done in a more constructive way. But all of these things need to be tackled in a very serious way before we can actually attract these companies. I saw a figure that of something like 35 companies, I beg your pardon, 45 companies that left China in the last 3 months. 28 went to Vietnam, 11 went to Malaysia, 3 or 6 or 7 to Cambodia, and only 3 came to India. Or not even came. 3 are considering and they're exploring with the government of India coming here. So we need to be much more attractive. If a country like Vietnam, which is even a communist dictatorship, is able to attract far more companies than we are, they're a much smaller country. I'm sorry that we really need to get our act together.
So how do you think that leads me to my question of how do you think India has handled this entire lockdown? What do you think India? You answered my question. But what do you think India needs to do to revive the economy? But do you think how that was answered? But do you think we are handling the whole situation good? Because as I said earlier, what we knew day one is different to what we know today, and every day is a new information that the world is giving us about this pandemic. So, what's your take on how India has handled it?
Well, first of all, as far as the economy is concerned, apart from what I said about making it easy for businesses to come to India, there are also very important things the government should do to look after our poor, our marginalized, our migrant workers, make sure that there's a proper support package, and make sure that there is a proper fiscal stimulus. It's amusing that a conservative government in the UK has done something that a government in India has not been able to think of doing, which is they've announced that for every company that doesn't fire someone, they will pay 80% of that person's wage. So the company which is not able to pay a salary because they're not making any money only has to pay 20% to persuade that employee to take a 20% cut in order to keep that person on the books. And at the same time, the government will cover the cost. Now, India has not come up with anything comparable to help people like that. So there are all these things we should be doing for the economy. And we've said that for the poorest of the poor, just put 7,500 rupees into their Jan Dhan accounts so they at least don't have to worry where their next meal is coming. It's tragic that so many people are starving. Now, on the larger question of how we're handling the lockdown, I would say, first of all, it came as a needed measure, but it came a bit late. Many of us have been advocating it. I had been calling for it on Twitter and social media for 10 or 15 days before it was done. Many others had recommended some measures earlier. But what we had wanted was for it to be a planned measure. The Prime Minister, who gave the nation 48 hours to try out a Sunday curfew, gave the nation only 4 hours for a 21-day curfew. That was a very strange decision. And in the process, a number of things that should have been planned better never happened. People weren't given enough notice to make arrangements. Migrant workers couldn't go home. Trains weren't running. Planes weren't running. Buses weren't running. Highways were shut. How do human beings manage to adjust in a 4 hours notice? So these were all, I think, troubling things about the way the government did it. So the lack of proper economic relief measures, the lack of an economic stimulus package so far, the contradictory and confusing regulations, as well as the initially unnecessarily draconian measures to enforce the lockdown. All of these things and the lack of compassion and empathy with which it was done are things we can reproach the government for. But the fact of the lockdown, we can't. I think the lockdown was initially necessary. Now they're talking about easing it, but they need to do 2 or 3 things. Number one, they need to dramatically increase our test kits capacity, because lockdown alone is not a solution. It has to be married to a meaningful testing campaign so we know where the illness is spreading. Secondly, it needs to be accompanied by credible economic measures. Thirdly, it needs to be decentralized. For example, we have a system now where the central government says this district is red zone, this district is green zone. Well,
yes.
If the red zone is a district where there have been 2 new cases in the last week, or whatever the criterion is, let's take that as an example. Now, wouldn't it be better if the local authorities decided the entire district needs to be that way? Let's say the 2 cases do exist, but they happen to be in one building. Wouldn't it be enough to just contain the people in that building and treat them and isolate them and trace their contacts rather than shutting down the entire district? But how will the central government decide that? Let the local authorities have more authority is part of my answer to what you're saying.
I think that is really fantastic to hear your point of view with all of this. And when the lockdown is done, as me talking to a lot of people through the lives that I do, I'm really afraid to go out. Like, I don't know when I'll feel comfortable going to a restaurant or a movie theater. But some people say they're going to come back with a vengeance. People are going, they're waiting to come out. Do you think we'll bounce back to how our life used to be, or it's going to be a new reality?
No, I don't think we're going to bounce back in a while, at least not until the virus is well and truly gone, or if a very effective vaccine has been found. Until then, we're going to have to, even if there's an easing of the lockdown and only a modest number of cases, the threat that it could come back and spread at random will oblige us to keep social distancing norms, to suddenly sanitizer is going to be a big growth industry because everyone's going to carry sanitizers. They'll have it at home, they'll have it in their cars, they'll have it in shops, they'll have it in hotels. I think everyone is going to have masks handy so that when they meet a stranger, they're masked. Obviously, family members, close friends, you'll take some chance. But with strangers and just going out on the street, going to a shop and so on, I don't think you're going to see people going unmasked for a while yet. So I don't expect us to be living the way we were leading our lives before the middle of March. I think
it's a new reality and a new life, you say.
It will be a new reality for the time that it takes for the virus to either completely disappear from the face of the country or the earth, and or for a vaccine to be found that can be effective.
Today we see a lot of countries turn inward in terms of what we need to do for solutions and not looking at global institutions. How do you perceive that?
I think you're right, Lakshmi. I think you're seeing a lot of countries turning more nationalist, more protectionist, more obsessed about their sovereignty. When the Prime Minister of India spoke to a number of panchayat chiefs, his message was self-reliance, 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 which was like a throwback to the 1950s. That was the sort of Nehruvian slogan, which we thought Mr. Modi would be against. We've outgrown that mantra since the 1991 liberalization. We've become a much more globalized economy. We're well-connected international trade networks and supply chains. We ourselves want people to make in India in order to export abroad. That's all these things don't fly well with the idea of suddenly turning inward, getting out of trade relationships, getting out of free trade zones, getting out of other things. I think it may be a major mistake, and it may actually lead to a country like India having an economic setback if we do it that way. So I would have preferred we stay internationally engaged, we support the international system, we actually work for constructive reforms so it works better. That would be the way that I would be inclined to go.
Fabulous. So I have a couple more about your writing and your love for language. That's a question that a lot of my friends wanted me to ask of you. When did it start? Is it something you fell in love with it, or your love for the language? And I knew you speak multiple different languages. Can you speak about how you got to be so profound in so many languages and writing books? And
well, how do you really write in English? My articles in other languages appear really because somebody took the trouble to translate them. But the truth is that one never really quite knows, why people. My father was always obsessed with words. He was very fond of words, word games. We constantly had word games at home, Scrabble and bingo. I'm not bingo. What is that game? I forgot it. There's a game with letters and dice that you roll. Was it Yahtzee? I can't remember. Anyway, we had a number of word games. We would make up word games for car journeys, where you would imagine a word and we'd have to guess the letters and all this stuff. So we grew up very, very fond of words, both my sisters and me. And as far as I'm concerned, I also enjoyed reading and writing. My father had a gift for a turn of phrase in his letters, but he hardly ever wrote articles or stories. But from a very young age, because I was an asthmatic child, confined to bed very often, and I ran out of books to read, and I grew up in India without any television or any, Nintendo and computers and mobile phones weren't even a gleam in an inventor's eye. And so the only things I had to distract me were words, and if I couldn't read them, then I tried to write them. And at 6, I started writing stories, very imitative and derivative of the stories I was reading, Enid Blyton and Biggles and all of those stories. But by writing, I learned to write. I was first published when I was just 10 years old.
Wow.
And, it's really as addictive as the first case, Lakshmi. I mean, the truth is that the moment you see your name in print, you want to do it again. You become a recidivist, and so I kept writing for every English language publication in India in the 60s
What
and
is?
early
I
70s.
have 4 minutes with you. I need a few more questions to get through.
Okay, so
What
you
are the
asked a
books
question
you're
that
reading
doesn't
right
give you
now?
a
I
short
know,
answer.
I lost my time. I know. So, what are the books you're reading right now? What is the one thing that, as we are all going inward and really looking at our lives in a different way, what is the one thing that you see, what you've realized about yourself, and what are the books that you're reading right now?
Well, to be honest, I have been reading in order to write. So actually, because I have a lot of work to do on my computer, on the phone, and in virtual communication for my constituency. But because I'm not traveling as I normally insanely do, and I'm not having as many meetings as I normally do, I've been able to work on a couple of books. I finished one that was almost finished before the lockdown, and that's a slightly silly word-related book that Penguin's bringing out called Tharoorasaurus, which is a combination of my name with Tyrannosaurus and Thesaurus. So that will be coming out once all this virus is behind us. And then I started and I'm well advanced on a draft of a book on nationalism. What nationalism is in theory, in practice, around the world, and then specifically in India. What's happened in the last few years on Indian nationalism, the contesting ideas in India between the, if you like, the all-inclusive, what's called secular or pluralist idea of India that the freedom movement fought for, and that's reified in the constitution, and then the Hindutva, Hindu Rashtra sort of idea. And I think that would be a book that I hope people will find interesting. At least it's meant to be a serious reflection on something that many Indians take for granted. We're all nationalists, but what does that mean? And how can it be? And what kind of nationalism is good for India? So that's what that book is all about. I must say that therefore a lot of my reading has been both academic and scholarly stuff on nationalism, as well as, of course, political commentary on recent debates on nationalism in India. So if you wanted to, I would have loved to have been able to say I'm rereading my P.G. Woodhouses, or you want to be really literary, and I was tempted to talk about reading books about similar plagues and major pandemics. There's Camus' The Plague, which I would need to reread. I read it over 20, 30 years ago. There's Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, which, if we can imagine Love in the Time of COVID coming out one day from somebody. I was thinking of Boccaccio's Decameron, which I've only dipped into and read extracts of. 500 years old, but again, a book of stories set in a plague. So there's a lot of literature about plagues and pandemics, but I thought it was more important to use this unexpected bonus of not having to travel and not having to meet too many people to actually produce something more lasting. So I've been writing.
I wish you all the very best. I'm looking forward to those books coming out. How has it been being quarantined with one of your sister and mother?
So well, it's been an amazing experience, Lakshmi, because I spent more time with them bonding in these last 45 days than probably in my entire adult life. Because though we had a good relationship,
or you're like, Ma, stop that.
I'm sure we get on each other's nerves once in a while. We're no different from anybody else. But the fact is, I'm going to miss them terribly if they move on to other things. My sister will have to go back to London. She has a husband and a son waiting for her. Two of our sons are grown up, but the third one is just graduating and coming back home. So she'll want to be back next month at least. And my mom, though I'm urging her to spend more and more time with me in Delhi, she still has a home of her own in Kochi. And she wants to get back to where she's the boss. So I told her she's the boss here, but she won't take me seriously. So there we are. But it's been a great time with them. It's been one of the few bonuses of this very difficult time for everybody, that at least many of us have rediscovered the closeness and the joys of family in ways that normal life would never have allowed us to. My sister would often come on holiday to India, stay at my home, but she'd be doing her own thing, I'd be doing my own thing. We'd meet for meals occasionally, and maybe she would accompany me to a dinner or an event once in a while. But the kind of quality time we've had, she's made an exercise fiend out of me because she's been nagging me every day to exercise.
Have you been exercising with her?
I've been doing 90 minutes a day, Lakshmi. fitter than ever.
I'm so proud. That's amazing. Wow,
So,
it took your sister to stay in quarantine and lock you down to get you to start working out.
exactly. Well, get me not to stop working out. Starting a working
Because you have nowhere else to go, right? So, motivational speech or stand-up comedy? What was that? I mean, as an actor, I'm really curious. I know you're used to the public platform, but it's something that you know that you do. You can do it all the time. But how was it doing a stand-up comedy?
huge risk. A huge risk.
Was it really? Were you nervous?
Yeah, because I mean, the thing is, in real life, whether in politics or any of my other public platforms, if I crack a joke and it falls flat, I can turn more serious. You can judge the audience and move away. With stand-up comedy, you can't afford to have a joke fall flat. Because if the jokes aren't working, there is no stand-up comedy. So, and they was doing it in front of a live audience in a comedy club. That's where they recorded it. And
How was that?
It was, I had absolutely no idea what the experience was like. I dressed badly. I had a jacket that was too tight. I was uncomfortable. They had makeup people who did all sorts of weird things to my hair. I mean, the whole thing, I couldn't have started off with more disadvantages. But then when I went on stage and they gave me a lovely introduction and there was rousing applause, which put me at ease, and my very first opening lines got me such lovely reaction from the audience, then I was able to relax a bit more. And I thought it went surprisingly well. In fact, the actual act was longer than what you saw on television. I did 22, 23 minutes and they broadcast 10 because we actually did the live act in May while the elections were still going on. So many of the jokes, were political and appropriately timed for the election time, but seemed less relevant 3 or 4 more months later when Mr. Modi had won handsomely. So by the time they broadcasted, many of those jokes and other things went. But it was a fun event, and I'm glad I did it. I'm not going to do it again. Because,
No, you didn't. No, that was
no.
I'm gonna ask
I was told by a Malayali singer you should stop singing when your voice is still good. That was good advice.
So, talking, there was a movie that people said you were a part of, and I got pictures of that film from
wasn't me.
It wasn't you, but you
No.
know there's a lot on the net with your picture and circling it, saying it might be you. You know, I have that picture lined up.
I was working at the UN for 15 years before that movie was even made. No, they've identified the actor, and it certainly wasn't me. But I think the trolls thought it was a fun way of pulling my leg. Because the first 100 times or so...
That's the picture.
That's the one, yeah. And the first 100 times, I got exasperated with them and said, this is ridiculous. And then I got onto the joke. They were deliberately doing it, even though they realized it wasn't me. Because it was a young Gujarati actor of that time, who I'm told has sadly passed away. That's true. I'm sorry for his family. But in any case, there wasn't me. And the truth is, I was an actor on the stage in school and college. I did a lot of acting. I've acted not with, but against Rishi Kapoor in our school dramatic competition. I've managed to say I won the best actor 3 years in a row at Campion School, Bombay. So it's not as though I wouldn't have minded acting. But my life took a different direction. I acted in college at St. Stephen's. I played Antony to Meera Nair playing Cleopatra in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And then my swan song was when I joined the UN and there was a Geneva Amateur Dramatic Society which did Barefoot in the Park. And I played the dirty old man when I was all of 23 or something because they couldn't imagine a brown man playing the romantic lead. And therefore, I thought the hell with acting after that and got busy with my UN work and my writing instead.
Wow.
So there we are. That was my acting career.
That's fantastic. I know we went over time, and thank you that you stayed. But so give me a sentence that I have to go look in the dictionary now.
I don't think you'll need to look it up in the dictionary because it's all over the internet. Now that we've had this talk, do not indulge in floxinosinhydrobilification.
Thank you for that.
Take care. All the best, Lakshmi. All the best.
Thank you. My daddy gives his regards to you. Made sure he called me 5 minutes before as well and said, don't forget to say hello. Vishnu
was this, sorry?
My dad.
Oh, great. Give him my regards as well and your brother too. All the best, Lakshmi. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye.
Bye bye.